In this video, we're slowing things down a bit because I've got a lot of trains to show you. But first, I want to welcome back all of my regular viewers and welcome in any new first-time passengers along on this journey. Since this video is the second installment of my fall season freight trains video series, we'll focus mainly on that. However, when putting this video together, I kept running into things that required me to occasionally take us off track. For example, take note of the train moving across your screen right now. That's the Reading and Northern Yard Job, also known as the YJPI. You'll get a better look and understanding of this particular train in an upcoming video in the not too distant future. But I'm mainly talking about those flat cars and how freight cars move from one railroad to another. The other cars also have their own unique stories too. I'm also going to be talking a little more about the impending UP-NS merger, or should I say takeover. Now, this isn't the big video that I'm working on, make sure that you understand that much, but I will go into a little more detail as a lead up to that big video. I'm also going to be talking a little bit more about the US-Canada trade war that's going on and affecting the look and the length of Sunbury Line trains. But just like the UPS merger takeover video, this is not the main video of that topic. So, with all of that said, let's get this show on the road. Grab your favorite TV snacks and your favorite beverage, turn up the volume, and take a journey with me through freight trains in the fall season, part 2. We pick up where we left off in part 1 with the Reading and Northern Pittston to Scranton branch local and its power. The PISB, or Back Valley Job as it's sometimes called, is an almost daily local freight that services several industries on the Reading and Northern's Kaiser Valley Industrial Tract, sometimes called their back track. The easiest giveaway is the white insulated boxcars and occasional reefers that usually dominate its makeup. Next in line are the jumbo-covered hoppers for AZEC and Mitsubishi, and a boxcar and sometimes flat car for 7D Lumber, as we touched on in part 1. Usually attached to the PISB is the YJPI, which does its work interchanging inbound and outbound cars in Taylor Yard proper. Power for these yard jobs runs the gamut of in-cab switch engines, like we just saw a few minutes ago, to the biggest power the railroad has to offer. Today, it's one of the specially painted Fast Freight SD50-3s number 5019. There are now 4 of these company show ponies now that the 5021 has finally been painted. We travel back to November 2015, and today the leaves aren't the only color worth coming out to the tracks for. At the north end of Taylor Yard, Allentown, Pennsylvania bound 36T is meeting Montreal, Quebec bound 31T, and both have an abundance of unique locomotive power. Much of it is gone today. The Reading and Northern's PISB train isn't the only area train that came with a little extra on the end. At least it wasn't. For years, commuter cars were an occasional sight on the ends of Norfolk Southern's road trains, whether north or south, east or west. Indeed, passenger cars can sometimes be seen in the manifests of freight trains. These are non-revenue moves for the car owners, but they are revenue moves for the freight railroads involved. There are several reasons that commuter and passenger equipment may show up on a freight train. A car being delivered from a factory to a transit authority owner hundreds or even thousands of miles away is one example. Or passenger cars being sent to and from repair or refurbishment is another. When it occurs, passenger car movements are usually billed as passenger car, empty, or moving on its own wheels. One obscure and long-gone example of commuter cars on freight trains was the mainline Georgia Railroad mixed freights and Macon branch trains, which were operated up to 1983. The main purpose of this service was said to be to help keep a tax exemption in effect for the railroad. The trains averaged around 120 cars, and the Macon branch trains used heavyweight paired window coaches. In the passenger train era, many carriers operated mail and express trains so as to keep the head-in work off of their flyers, and there were many railway express agency cars that looked like freight box cars but actually had running gear that was fully compatible for passenger operations. Here in northeastern Pennsylvania, passenger cars being moved in freight trains used to be a common occurrence stretching as far back as the early 2000s. One restriction that's typically applied was that there was a trailing tonnage limit placed on the passenger cars, and for that reason, they would usually be at the rear of the train. New Jersey Transit cars, for example, were always on the rear, and because New Jersey cars were usually considered gallery cars, they were subject to the high and wide rules as well. Other cars that showed up in the area were those from the Maryland Area Regional Commuter Service, or better known as MARC, which services the metropolitan, Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, Maryland areas. Another common car were those from the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, or MBTA as it's better known. Amtrak superliners that were built at the Bombardier factory in Barre, Vermont were often interchanged with the Central Vermont, which later became the New England Central, at Montpelier Junction and were moved with their regular freights and on their own wheels. Transit and commuter equipment was usually shipped on flat cars. One problem with moving some cars on the rear is not having enough space above the knuckle to hook up an end-of-train device. Another said problem was that some equipment couldn't be coupled to a GE wide-body locomotive because the diaphragm would damage the pilot of the GE. I also heard that not coupling them to locomotives with snowplows was for the same reason. Back in 2010, Canadian Pacific made 4 or 5 moves of brand new commuter rail passenger cars from the Bombardier plant in Thunder Bay, Ontario, down through the Quad Cities for interchange in Kansas City, Missouri. They were for the New Mexico Rail Runner and the Utah Transit. Passengers are neither permitted nor wanted, so rarely, if ever, will you see occupied passenger cars on a freight train today, as the possibility of them getting hurt is just too great of a risk. And with today's sue-happy society and the railroad's increased interest in limiting liability exposure, I don't think you'll see it on a class-run railroad at all. If you do, the only 2 examples that I can think of are Amtrak's Auto Train and the now abolished Ringling Brothers Circus trains. A local short line might be willing to haul an occupied car in a mixed train if they have their own passenger excursion service. Amtrak used to haul private passenger cars, but if you wanted it dropped somewhere besides the terminal where they were already adding or dropping cars, it was most likely moving by a freight train. And if some sort of keeper is deemed necessary to ride and keep watch over equipment, they're usually manufacturers' representatives who are there to regularly inspect the shipment and or report any delays or exceptions in handling during the trip. You see this a lot with specialty high and wide loads. But rest assured that in these circumstances, the shipper pays some sort of add-on to the basic freight rate for carrying that representative and for incurring the risk of doing so. On local and regional railroads, you might see the railroad's own office car on the end of one of their freights, usually carrying officials on an inspection trip. As for the big Class 1s, nowadays they have entire office car specials for that purpose. Did you notice that NS Standard Cab -9 number 8824 bracketing the CSX and CP wide cabs on 36T? That same engine came back up on its sister train 37T, 8 hours later, leading an ex-Conrail SD60M, now long gone from the roster, along with the UP SD70 ACE and a wide cab -9 from NS, both dead in tow and all leading a short train back to Buffalo, New York. Power down, power up. It may not sound as good, but it isn't just for the north and southbound trains either. Looking back to earlier in the day, the passing of the 36T reveals the brutish elegance of another top hat leading train 31T and sporting full horse head paint. Norfolk Southern had over 1,200 -9s in total in 11 different phases, and that's not including the white phase or the Operation Lifesavers. I've started breaking down these individual phases with one video on the top hats and one video on the white faces. And in the spirit of the 1000th AC-44C6M number 4947 recently moving through town in the dark of night, of course, I've included them in this video. And as promised, I'll be finishing up that series in the weeks and the months to come. The GE C40-9 and C40-9W was essentially a derated C44-9W that was built specifically for the Norfolk Southern from the mid-1990s through the mid-2000s. Compared to the Western carriers, the Norfolk Southern was slow to adopt cab air conditioning, but by 1995, the road was specifying the installation of air conditioning on new units, and as such, the first delivery of -9 units is readily distinguishable from the previous -8 power with their cab roof-mounted air-conditioned units. These were the only -9 units that GE built without the North American-style cab. That's the wide cab. They were also the first NS production units to be delivered with electronic fuel injection and were unique among NS-9 deliveries in that they came with the Lucas-Bryce fuel injection system. These systems were upgraded to Bosch fuel injection equipment at the first overhaul 7 to 9 years later. After years of field testing, Wabtec introduced the first production version of its Epic electronic air brake system. These systems were also used on the 1996 and the 1997 orders. Also, per NS's desire, at the time, the railroad's first order of 4,000 horsepower -9s all came with the standard cabs instead of the more traditional wide cabs, also known as safety cabs of today. Eventually, the company was required by the FRA to purchase the wide cab design and was only able to roster about 125 units with the common standard cab. The -9 series followed the previous -8s in the mid-1990s with upgraded electronics and other components, and NS would come to own more than 1,200 of the C40-9s in various forms. And still relatively new locomotives at a then 20 years of age, all of the locomotives that NS purchased began being rebuilt as AC-4400 CWs, which NS classifies as the AC-44C6M. These newly minted rebuilds are commonly found all over the NS system and beyond, operating in heavy drag service given the tremendous tractive effort which they can produce. And just as the SD40 and all of its many variants came to symbolize EMD's conquest and domination of the diesel locomotive market in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, so is the case today with the GE C44-9W and its variants, which are the most successful 21st century diesel locomotives to date. The popularity of the model was due to its reliability, simplicity, and powerful prime mover, which have become traits that GE is known for. Spotting the older standard cab -9s was relatively easy as they had an air conditioning box on the top of the cab as opposed to the -8 predecessors. At the time of their purchase, it was rumored that NS was simply too frugal to purchase the increasingly popular safety cabs, but eventually the company was required by the FRA to purchase the wide cab design. But it also didn't hurt that GE started charging the same price for the wide cab C44s as for the standard cab C44s. One of the most noticeable spotting features over the -8s is that the -9 was one of the first to be equipped with GE's high adhesion or HTC truck, which helped to improve the wheel-to-rail contact. And in the spirit and the grand tradition of the hey you left out and hey you forgot guys out there, the AC-44C6 CF number 8520 was originally built by General Electric in 1996 as the -940CW number 8946. The unit was rebuilt and converted to AC traction at Norfolk Southern's Roanoke Locomotive Shop in Virginia. It was painted in a red variation of the main paint scheme, sometimes called the Sonic Bonnet paint scheme, at the Juniata shops in Altoona. The red color was chosen for the corporate colors of CAF in Spain, which was Norfolk Southern's partner in the design of the updated equipment and electronics. The 8520 was then sent for testing on the Western New York and Pennsylvania Railroad, but returned to Altoona in February of 2019 to pose for some company photographs. During this time, she was displayed at the turntable in Altoona with 4 other engines from the DC to AC program. 3 of these other engines were AC-44C6Ms, while the 4th was the SD-70ACC. In August 2019, after another period of testing on the WNYMP, 8520 was placed in storage in a siding at Driftwood, Pennsylvania. Reportedly, the locomotive was not moved properly and got flat spots on all 12 of her wheels. She stayed in Driftwood for at least 1 month. Sadly, the 8520 was a failed locomotive, and she turned out to be less reliable than the AC-44C6Ms. She was sent back to Altoona in September 2019 and ended up being sold to the Knoxville Locomotive Works in August of 2020. From there, it was sold to the Canadian National. The C40-9 and C40-9Ws that were built for Norfolk Southern were actually constructed a year after the C44-9W debuted in 1994. The model was a step up from the -8s in that it featured upgraded components and electronics such as new traction motors and a redesigned generator. The GE Model B13B traction motor, which replaced the Model 752, a design that had been used by the company dating back to the Universal series, although the new design was just as reliable, if not more so, than the former. The C40-9s and the Ws were one of the first GE locomotives that were equipped with the relatively new high adhesion or HTC truck, which helped to improve the wheel-to-rail contact, like we talked about before. The -9s, however, still carried GE's model 16-cylinder FDL prime mover. One of the design's notable selling points was the incredible tractive effort it offered, 140,000 pounds at starting and 109,000 pounds continuous, which also included the more powerful C44-9W models. Production of the locomotive began in early 1995, and all 125 original units purchased by the NS were completed that year. Very happy with this first batch and desperately needing power to keep up with the traffic demands of the economic boom occurring in the U.S. at that time, a year later, in early 1996, NS returned for more. Many more. In this case, the C40-9W model, which featured the wide safety cab. NS continued to purchase GE models like the C40-9W for nearly 10 years as needed through to late 2004 until GE ended production on the model. When GE released the more energy-efficient Evolution series, that's ES models, in 2005, NS continued to purchase the design in the new series as the ES40 DCs. By the time GE had closed out the C40-9W order for NS, it owned more than 1,200 of them in all. Up to that time, it was one of the largest ever single orders for a particular locomotive model by a railroad. And while it is tough to tell the given similarities between GE's present-day models, nearly all of Norfolk Southern's original fleet of the C44-9s and their wide cab variants continue to remain in regular freight service across its system as the rebuilt AC-44C6Ms. Like the Big Blue Leviathan known as Conrail that came before it, the Norfolk Southern never had many fancy, funky paint schemes on its diesel locomotives, at least not before the year of 2012. Also, like Conrail, NS was a minimalist road that did not believe in spending money on things like cosmetics. So when anything out of the norm came along on its diesels, there was sure to be a following that came along with it. For nearly 20 years from the date of its creation in 1982, NS's monochromatic black and white thoroughbred paint scheme was the mainstay of its engine fleet, and little about it changed in all of that time. But a handful of more than the 1,200 -9s that the railroad would ultimately acquire managed to escape the common corporate look of the railroad's status quo. Buried in the middle of the 9700 number series are about a dozen or so wide cabs that have a solid white face versus the ubiquitous unibrow that covers the windshields, headlight, and number boards of the other 99.8% of its Dash 9s. These white-faced Dash 9s can be somewhat hard to notice at first glance, but they're out there, just waiting to be discovered by the sharp-eyed rail fan. I caught number 9767 third out on NS Train 12T on June 25th, 2015, less than 3 months before NS would take over the D&H South lines. I caught it again 6 months later, almost to the day, on December 19, 2015. Far from Scranton, but still in Pennsylvania, it was just a few days before Christmas when I caught it again hustling westbound on the Pittsburgh line, rambling through Hummelstown, Pennsylvania on a unit intermodal train, probably bound for Chicago. By the spring of 2016, the A-Team, though the trains 10A and 11A, were scheduled freights on the Sunbury line. On May 5th of that year, white-faced Dash 9 number 9783 blasted northbound to Binghamton, New York with an 11A train in tow. 2 months later in the summer, and again almost to the day on July 18, 2016, the 11A's sister train NS Train 10A came south from Bingotown with the 9746 leading the descent. The following year in May of 2017, I caught the 9770 as it trumpeted by eastbound, second of two towards Enola on a manifest train that I didn't get the symbol of. 2 months later in July, I caught the 9746 again, the same one on that 10A that we just saw 2 trains back heading to Northumberland, gliding southbound again. This time it was the Enola-bound train 11Z. Another 2 months, and now it's Indian summer. The date is September 9, and today's 14R has the 9754 trailing second out of this train's typical 3 engines. Like all northbounds on this line, this train is destined for Binghamton, New York, where it will change crews, swap blocks of cars, and head further north to East Deerfield, Massachusetts, possibly as a different train symbol. Our last white-faced Dash 9 of this video comes to us in the form of an old friend that we've run into twice already over the past 2.5 years. 9767 is blasting northbound to Binghamton, New York. Not in second place or even third, but now it's leading the pack of 2 orange westerners on the assault of the 10-mile climb to Clark Summit. The second unit is an EMD SD70 ACE with the isolated cab, and third in line is a GE Evolution Series locomotive, more commonly called a GEVO. Dash 9 number 9046 is a pure thoroughbred right down to its paint. Built in 1997 as part of the third phase of Dash 9s to be bought and placed in service. The year 1999 saw the biggest number of, and maybe the most unique group of Dash 9s that NS would ever order at 150 units. No surprise, since this was the year that NS would start operations on its share of Conrail, and the railroad was in need of motor power from anywhere it could be found. Continuing the practice of taking delivery of new units early in the year, Norfolk Southern ordered another 120 Dash 9 units in 1997. As was the custom for all Dash 9 units, these locomotives were delivered in primer paint and later painted by the NS shop forces. Before the Conrail acquisition, this painting was done exclusively at Chattanooga, Tennessee. By 1997, the paint scheme included 3M reflectorized decals along the side set. The intermittent dashes of reflective material later changed to a solid line, conforming several years in advance to an FRA regulation on reflectorization. Units 9127 and 9128 were fitted with the prototype electronic air brake system named CCB2, produced by a Wabtec competitor, the New York Air Brake Company. This system included self-diagnostics and was installed on all later Dash 9 units. Canadian National number 2412 is one of 81 Dash 840 CMs that were built for that railroad. In video T587, I did a deep dive into the incredible historical lives of these ultra-unique wide-body diesels. I'll leave a link to that video in the description box just in case you missed it. As you watch this Canada-bound manifest roll by under the beautifully somber November sky, pay close attention to what you don't see in the manifest. We'll talk a little bit more about it at the end of the train. Remembering that this is 2015, what you didn't see in this Canadian train was any of the yellow TTX T-Box or F-Box or blue GATX high-capacity boxcars. With all of the talk about the proposed UP-NS merger takeover, one thing that hasn't gotten much coverage is the effect that it would have on probably its biggest commodity in the railroad today, intermodal. J.B. Hunt, Schneider National, the UMAX Container Pool, and STG Logistics would all have some difficult choices to make. J.B. Hunt uses NS in the east, but the BNSF in the west, so kiss the benefit of single-line service goodbye. The same goes for Schneider National and STG, who uses CSX in the east and UP in the west. Only the Hub Container Group comes out unscathed, as they already use NS in the east and UP in the west. Today, we're taking a break from November and rail fanning on October 14, 2017, where Train 37T rounds the bin with a duo of potential things to come. Although not future power for us here in town anyway, Veterans Day 2017 gave us a Train 37T with the rare lashup of orange pumpkin power. As I've said in numerous past videos, BNSF power is rare here in northeastern Pennsylvania, and with the fall colors as a backdrop, this made for an exceptionally colorful train in all aspects. Back in November of 2017, early morning finds these tank cars on the north leg of the Steamtown Y. Too bad for us, as Train 37T with a colorful look into the future heads north behind a lash up that I call the Technicolor Trio. Later that same day, I was moving through town when the radio stops me. The northbound train 14R crew was giving back track authorities to the D&H dispatcher at CP679. Take note, this was before the Sunbury/Riverline split of 2018. I'd heard that the lead locomotive wasn't an Ola, but just never made the connection. It became apparent when rounding the curve and past my camera came the 1067 Reading Heritage Unit in perfect evening light. The Reading is among my favorites of Heritage units, even with the battered paint job. Fortunately, it's since been repainted. They all look great, but for myself, the ones that stand out for me are in this order: the Delaware and Hudson, the Virginian, the Reading, the Lehigh Valley, the Conrail, and the Pensy. 5 days later, on November 21, Train 14R came up the line with more future freight power and another 25th anniversary Operation Lifesaver-9, just like the one that we saw on Train 31T back in 2015. Freight cars of interest in this manifest is the big block of bathtub gondolas, the J.M. Huber jumbo hoppers, and the spine flat cars with what appears to be new telephone poles. I view this train perhaps with the most emotion. It's November 13, 2017, and we get a good look at the present, the past, and the potential future all in one locomotive combo. Enola, Pennsylvania to Binghamton, New York, Train 14R moves northbound through town as it had hundreds of times before and would hundreds more times. We'll come back to this train in a few minutes, but first.
Since the Industrial Revolution, railroads have been a legendary part of building America, fueling the economy and supporting thriving communities nationwide. Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern have a vision: America's first transcontinental railroad. This historic combination will create a faster, more efficient railroad, one that seamlessly connects the East and West Coast, 50,000 route miles across 43 states, linking 100 ports and reaching nearly every corner of North America. It positions railroads to continue accelerating new technologies, staying current with the current to move the freight industry forward and enhance competition.
The pairing of the East and the West brings lots of questions and concerns. For me, it makes me wonder what will become of older power like the DC GEVOs. Hopefully they can be rebuilt into AC GEVOs, or maybe even better, the AC CTEs. One locomotive that sadly did not survive Norfolk Southern's PSR purge of 2020 was the Dash 840 CW. Most notably, the 8391, which came up the line back on November 21, 2017. The standard cabs were the first to go, with the wide cabs following shortly after. Before it was cast aside, fortunately for us, the 8391 did survive long enough to be filmed by me and by NS, as to be included in our 2 videos outlining the merger picture.
Imagine seamlessly hauling steel from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Colton, California, and moving tomato paste from Herrin, California to Fremont, Ohio. Moving lumber from the Pacific Northwest, plastics from the Gulf Coast, copper from Arizona and Utah, and soda ash from Wyoming. Right now, tens of thousands of railroaders are moving almost everything we use. Together, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern will unleash the industrial strength of American manufacturing, transform the U.S. supply chain, create new sources of economic growth, and preserve union jobs. Rail is a cost-effective alternative to trucking, reducing congestion on our nation's highways, enhancing U.S. competitiveness, and bringing rail volumes and jobs back home. With a single coast-to-coast network, customers will benefit from faster transit times by eliminating interchanges where rail cars are handed off. Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern will create the safest and best freight transportation system in the world for our people, our customers, our shareholders, our communities, and our nation.
A little something for you modelers, take note of the different color and maybe even style of the roof hatches. Another hopper card to note are those Wells Fargo Rail reporting mark WFRX leasers. This one is branded for the Canadian Malting Company Limited, which made occasional appearances up and down the line for several years leading up to 2020 and PSR. For our last train of this video, and I chose it specifically, we return back to November 1, 2015, the same day that we ironically caught every railroad at play today, minus the UP and the BNSF. We have this late evening train 30T with the trifecta of Dash 9s hustling south to Enola. In 2 more months, this train symbol would be folded into the 11R to Enola, which itself will become the 11Z a few months after that. And besides the power, the train symbol, and many of the cars that make up its manifest, the personality of this train seems to have vanished with the steady, unrelenting march of time. Change is unavoidable, and like the seasons of nature, railroading is always changing and morphing. So it remains to be seen what the next season of change has in store for the railroad industry and the people like me watching. As I said in the beginning, this is not the main conversation for either the UP-NS merger, takeover, or the trade tariff dispute between the US and Canada, but I think that it gets us off to a good running start. But if you enjoyed this particular video, please hit that like button so that others can become acquainted with this channel. And as always, if you have something to add to the conversation, put your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. In 1 or 2 more videos ahead, we'll pick up where we left off with more freight trains of the fall season, along with the main videos for trade tariff trains and the UP-NS merger takeover. Until then, thanks for watching, and stay safe out there by the tracks.